self-concept, a self-definition that provides continuity and guides one's life. Difficult conditions threaten the self-concept, as people cannot care for themselves and their families or control the circumstances of life. Powerful self-protective motives then arise. The motive to defend the self, one's life and safety, and the motive to defend the psychological self, one's self-concept, values, and way of life. There is a need to protect self-esteem and to protect values and traditions. Another important cultural characteristic that contributes to a sense of vulnerability, writes Staub, is a past history of victimization. Just like victimized individuals, groups of people, he writes, who have been victimized in the past are intensely affected. Their sense of self is diminished. They come to see the world and people in it, especially outsiders, individuals as well as whole groups, as dangerous. They feel vulnerable, needing to defend themselves, which can lead them to strike out violently. Healing by victimized groups is essential to reduce this likelihood that they become perpetrators. Many of Utah's settlers had experienced the trials and deprivations of Missouri and Illinois in the 20 years prior to 1857. These Latter-day Saints had a deep sense of persecution and victimization, and they had not healed. Rather, in the isolation of the Great Basin, they nursed their anger and their suspicion of outsiders. When they learned in 1857 that a U.S. Army was approaching the territory, they perceived the Army as dangerous and felt an intense need to defend themselves. Southern Utah was no exception. When news of the approaching Army reached Cedar City, Isaac Haight reportedly said in a public gathering, if we are to believe a much later statement on the subject, "I am prepared to feed the enemy the bread he fed to me and mine." Another important cultural characteristic, says Staub, is the rigidity or the adaptability of a society. Rigidity and flexibility partly depend on societal self-concept, the way a group and its members define themselves. Greater rigidity, he writes, makes the difficulties of life more stressful. Utah society, particularly Southern Utah society, was quite rigid in the 1850s, much more rigid than the Utah of our day. During the Walker War, for example, several people in Cedar City objected to instructions from leaders in Salt Lake to send their cattle north for safekeeping. Instead of patiently working with these people, some leaders chose to treat the rebellion as a kind of treason potentially punishable by death. Although no one was executed, some people who received or witnessed harsh treatment ultimately left the territory. The short-run result of this exit was less diversity among the citizenry and a strengthened sense of rigidity in applying and following rules. In this regard, it is interesting to note how often Mountain Meadows Massacre participants later tried to excuse their participation in the mass killing by saying they had no choice but to conform. Episodes like this one from the Walker War, in which those unwilling to conform simply left the region, led to even less diversity or pluralism in a society that was already monolithic. Staub writes that monolithic societies with a limited set of acceptable values and ways of life may be more disturbed by change. In a pluralistic society with a balance of diversity and consensus, greater tolerance for differences among groups of people can be expected. Real pluralism, he writes, prevents the development of broad support for harming the victims. Southern Utah in 1857 did have some pluralistic characteristics. Settlers had varied backgrounds, hailed from different parts of the United States and Europe, and lived in communities that differed somewhat in character one from another. That pluralism manifested itself when council members in both Parowan and Cedar City voted against leaders' plans to take hostile action against the Arkansas immigrants. Sadly, in the end, however, it was the monolithic nature of the community that prevailed, and the will of these councils was disregarded. A monolithic society had been encouraged and fostered for years. In 1852, one of the leaders in southern Utah described the process with a metaphor. "We found a Scotch party, a Welsh party, an English party, and an American party," he wrote, "and we turned iron masters and undertook to put all these parties through the furnace and run out a party of saints." Unifying people in doing good, of course, is a laudable goal. But if some of those same people instead unify in doing wrong, the result can be disastrous. According to Staub, a monolithic, in contrast to pluralistic society with a small range of predominant values and/or limitations on the free flow of ideas, adds to the predisposition for group violence. The negative representation of a victim group and the definition of reality by authorities that justifies or even necessitates the victim's mistreatment will be more broadly accepted. When local leaders and others decided that Arkansas immigrants were a threat, community members accepted that judgment and acted accordingly. For example, on the day before the massacre, when many of the militiamen had assembled at the Mountain Meadows, the president of Cedar City's Benevolence Society advised the women in her group to attend strictly to secret prayer in behalf of the brethren that were out acting in our defense. Monolithic societies sometimes share another potentially dangerous condition that Staub describes: leaders who hold too much power and wield it improperly. He writes, "Even in a democratic system, leaders are often isolated. Surrounded by a small group of decision makers, they lack direct contact with citizens. Moreover, their power can be enormous even in a system of government purportedly based on checks and balances. Inherent in the leadership role, unfortunately," he writes, "is a tendency to view people as instruments and devalue opposition. This is more likely when the leader's power is great and his accountability low, and when the leader is guided by a coherent ideology which offers certainty of goals." I would venture to say that virtually everyone in our audience today is aware of teachings in the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants, two books of Latter-day Saint scripture, that warn of the dangers of misused power. "We have learned by sad experience," wrote Joseph Smith of abuses of power among Latter-day Saints in Missouri, "that it is the nature and disposition of almost all men, as soon as they get a little authority, as they suppose, they will immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion." Isaac Haight, the principal leader in Cedar City, had a tremendous amount of power concentrated in him. As stake president, mayor, president of the Deseret Iron Company, and militia major, he was the spiritual, political, economic, and military leader of Cedar City. Except for William Dame, his direct military commander in Parowan, he was not accountable to anyone in the region, nor did anyone hold higher authority than him at the time in southern Utah. His distance and isolation from decision makers in Salt Lake City made his own decisions temporarily beyond appeal. Without telegraph lines running to Salt Lake and at least 6 days required for round-trip messenger service, no one could step in quickly to overrule or circumvent his decisions except Dame. When Haight sought out Dame regarding the besieged immigrants at the Meadows, Dame called a council, which decided to assist the immigrants in continuing on their journey in peace. Just as he had done with the Cedar City Council members who had opposed him, Haight devalued this opposition. Immediately after the council ended, he got Dame on his own, away from the tempering consensus of his council. Haight shared with Dame additional details he had not shared with the council. In isolation, the two leaders talked, and Haight left feeling he had permission to use the militia to carry out a mass killing. Cedar City leaders also viewed local Paiute Indians, many of whom were at least nominally members of their own faith, as mere tools to be doubly used, first to assist with the killing, and second to suffer the entire blame for what the leaders themselves had initiated. As the Book of Mormon emphasizes, there is great danger in the interplay between misused authority and overly compliant followers. Using King Noah as an illustration, King Mosiah exclaims, "For behold how much iniquity doth one wicked king cause to be committed, yea, and what great destruction." Not surprisingly, authority and obedience are two more characteristics that often play a role in mass killings. Staub explains, "Strong respect for authority and strong inclination to obedience are other predisposing characteristics for mass killing and genocide. They make it more likely that responsibility will